you have to raise the rate, some taxpayers are going to hit their caps, and you're not going to be able to calculate or to collect your full increase in the maximum levy. How much less would you collect in terms of revenue? Over 5 years, 47,000 or 47,000 in the 5th year for Delphi schools, 48,000 for Delphi City. So, you know, one of the things I wanted to hear from you is that a big number or a small number? Is that a number that you have to worry about, or is that a number that that will be, you know, on the right side of the decimal place in terms of percentage?
As just a comment, I guess, as a councilman, the Carroll County numbers are a hell of a lot smaller than that.
Yes.
$40,000 out of the side of our budget is
Yeah. Okay. That's what I wanted to.
$48 for Delphi schools, that's one less school bus.
It doesn't allow you to grow.
Well,
Each school bus is $98,000.
Half school bus.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, yeah, and that's how it comes out, you know, and so, and one of the reasons it comes out so small is that your tax rates are so low. Outside of Delphi and Flora, your tax rates, the taxpayers pay, let's get back to this, are really low. These are really low tax rates when you compare to the rest of the state. You get numbers like 98 cents, $1.09, 99 cents, $1.26, $1.04. That's in the lowest 10% of tax rates among taxing districts in Indiana. And what have you got? You've got Camden at 291, Flora at 277, and Delphi at 340. Those are the three places, the only three places where you really got significant tax cap credits already. So if in Monroe Township at $1.22, if their tax rate goes up 19 cents to $1.40, that still means nobody's eligible for tax cap credits. You would expect to see any, or not much, of an impact in Monroe Township. Only in Flora and Delphi and the units that overlap those are you going to see an impact. Now, you know, there will be places in Indiana where you've got a lot of farmland, but you've also got some relatively high property tax rates, and they will be affected more. But, you know, I was a little surprised as well to see just how small those numbers were. At least I looked at the numbers, I thought, those look small. Will the people in Carroll County and the government officials who have to deal with these revenue losses, will they think it's small? Half a school bus tells me that's relatively small.
What's your levy sheet?
It's actually lower this year. I can't remember at the time. He had 2.03. I think we're down to
No,
one.
your total levy.
Oh, I just shy of 1,300,000, I believe.
That's good notes back here.
So what's the average, you're saying we're in the lower 10%, so what, for the state?
Oh, as far as tax district rates. Inside a city or town, or a taxing district rate that overlaps a city or town, the median, the middle value is $2.50. And for rural, it's $1.50.
So is that unreasonable?
Depends on whether you pay them or not, I guess. Well, you know, $2.50, $1.50, if by unreasonable you mean how do we compare to the rest of the country, those are relatively low. We're not a big property taxing state, at least not as far as homeowners are concerned, that's for sure.
You've used in your presentation along the way reference to if this stays the same, but there's other impacts.
Yes, yes.
Can you identify a few of those other?
Okay, yes. What's happening to home values? Are the home values rising or are they not? During the recession, home values went down, and our assessment system now catches that. 2 years later, for taxes 2 years later, our assessment system will actually catch that, and we saw it in the data. And that's something relatively new. That was the first recession we had since we went to the market value and use system, where we're actually trying to measure assessments based on selling prices of houses and other properties. And so our assessment system catches that. So if property values go down, a couple of years later, assessed values go down as well. Well, if your property values are going up, then 2 years later, assessed values will go up as well. So what's happening to home values would be one of the things to consider. Is there much new housing construction? Would be another thing to consider. Are there going to be new businesses expanding or locating in Carroll County? There's the question of the dark store or the dark box issue. Some of the big Walmarts and Myers and Lowe's and companies like that have been going through legal channels to try to get their assessments reduced. Should they be able to do that, if that succeeds, that could reduce your assessed value. So all that stuff that influences assessed value will be the changes that these will be put over top of, I guess you might say. So, you know, if your assessed, or if your levy would have gone up 100 in the county, would have gone up 100,000, maybe now it goes up only 80 over the course of those years. So whatever happens. So what else happens? Well, what about the levy? You've got the maximum levy increase of 3.5% to 4%. So that levy will increase. Any new bond issues that go out for additional debt service rates, any new bond issues or old bond issues that come off, reducing the debt service rate. Any referenda rates, if school corporations try a referendum. Twin Lakes did one, I think, if I'm not mistaken. That would be another thing. All of those things, those are the kinds of things we're talking about as to what else will go on. And I really have no way of predicting what else will go on. The thing about the assessed value is you can predict that. We can predict that with fair confidence 5 years out. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I think I must have misinterpreted your summation, but I wrote down that when the dust settles for next year, we'll have an estimated loss of 0.3%.
In total revenue.
Total revenue.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's it.
Just want to make sure.
That's right. I know. I know. It would be a real tragedy for all involved if it turns out to be a whole lot bigger. If it's a whole lot smaller, we won't care. But it can't be a whole lot smaller, can it? Because that's pretty much down to zero. So remembering that this is the difference between what would have happened if assessed value farmland had not changed and what will happen given that it will change. So it's this amount added to, subtracted from what would have happened otherwise. So yeah, I'm getting, the moral of the story, I'm getting small numbers.
Thank you.
Does this reflect a levy increase, or is this assuming no levy increase?
This is assuming no levy increase. This is basically what would the world have looked like in 2017 if assessed value farmland had been lower and everything else had been the same. So it just isolates just the impact of assessed value on farmland.
Who sets the maximum levy in tax circuit breakers? Is that state?
That's in the Constitution now. That 1%, 2%, 3% is
State.
the state, but even the state can't change it now without passing a constitutional amendment and getting the people to vote for it.
So both the maximum levy and the circuit breakers are set in stone?
Well, no, the maximum
Additional
levy is
laws?
not, actually. The maximum levy is statute. So that came out of the Bowen administration's tax reform back in 1973. So that's an old one. It was significantly revised in 2002, but it was passed by legislation. So they changed the way it was calculated back in 2002. And right now it is based on a 6-year average of Indiana income increases. So you take a look at statewide increases in wages, interest, rent, and profit added together. And the increase has been, on average, about 4% over the last 6 years. And so that's the increase that is going to be allowed on the property tax levies. And the idea behind that is that we will keep the levy rising at about the same rate as the ability to pay of Indiana taxpayers, as measured by their income. So we're going to keep taxes and incomes rising at about the same rate. And that's the idea behind that. What it means, though, is that if there's a recession and incomes are low or actually decline, then for the next few years you'll have a small number or a negative number inside that calculation, and that will slow down the increase in the levy. And those of you involved may remember that for several years in a row, the maximum levy increase was less than 3%. And that's because the 2009 recession year income drop was in the calculation until about a year ago when it was removed, and then So, and again, that's in statute. They could revise that if they wanted to. They did a major revision of that in 2002. The other thing to remember is it's important to keep those two straight. Because the maximum levy is a restriction on what the local government can do with its budget. Whereas the tax caps are a restriction on how much taxpayers have to pay. And so in a sense, nobody's in charge of the tax caps. Because what taxpayers have to pay is the sum total of the county and the township and the city and the school and the library rate. And so no one unit controls that. And yet that's what determines what the tax caps are going to be and what the tax cap credit revenue losses are going to be.
One quick question, does the formulation include any cumulative funds that a township or a unit might have? And what does the farmland reduction look from an accumulative fund?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I did the calculation, I assumed a constant levy, but the cume funds have a constant rate, don't they? So one would have to split that out. It's usually a smaller share of the total, but yes, actually, so that might create some revenue losses if there's no room to raise that rate. So that rate would have a ceiling. So it's a good point. Losses might be a little bit greater in places where, and this would be just in places where there's a significant amount of farmland. So those townships, the county, and the school corporation might lose a little bit from the cume funds. Good point. So that's something I neglected to put into my model, but yes.
Do you think that could be a higher dollar figure than you're seeing here?
It might be a little bit higher than that. You know, when you talk about the $3.40 rate in Delphi, or even the $1 rate in some of the townships, the cume funds, 2, 3, 4 cents.
Right.
So it's going to be pretty small.
Because
I still got 3 bottles of water here to drink. I didn't want to keep asking questions.
Because I'd like to ask Ann or the council or whoever put this on, what is the takeaway? What are we to take away from this meeting? What are we trying to understand here or gain from it?
I guess I look at Carroll County as not, we are going to have a significant drop in revenue, but we are going to not experience much growth. Are we going to be able to, everybody wants to move forward, and I don't see that happening if we're going to, even if we're not going to lose very much, you're going to stay static. So the point is, we all have to work together to make sure, if we start raising our taxes significantly to make up the difference, we will get tax caps, we will have problems, and we're depending, this is about property taxes. We have to consider that there's also income taxes. And I think the whole thing, just the whole big picture together. If you start trying to make up the difference over the years, and it's, like I said, it's going to take several years for this to happen. But if you try to make up the difference and it's just not there, we could experience more revenue loss just because of trying to raise our taxes higher to make up the difference. And I don't think, it doesn't appear that it's as serious as it sounded like it could have been.
Thank you.
Because we have our own, we have the accurate numbers now. We didn't have any numbers like this.
Yeah, it seemed catastrophic when you're hearing about 35% assessments.
Yeah.
This sounds pretty precipitous, but I mean, for the most part, I don't think that there's any cataclysm in the future. I think the biggest thing is just gonna be making sure that we all communicate, and, Shane's gonna take a haircut, but it looks like he's doing it anyway.
So yeah, let's think about the 35. That sounds really serious, right? But the 35 is on 1/3 of the tax base. That puts it down to 12. At 12%, is a decline in assessed value that will cause the rates to increase, which means that levies can continue to rise, except when the rate increase hits up against the tax caps for the few people in Carroll County who are actually at their tax caps, because you're a relatively low tax place. And so it means basically Delphi and a couple of the other towns. So you go from 35 to 12 to what gets subtracted from the maximum levy increase, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And, you know, I think what everybody's having trouble with is here's an economist giving them good news, and that never happens. Yeah, it's mine.
But I think it's good that we saw this.
No,
We didn't have the idea.
One last thing,
And if the county builds a new jail and bounds that, is that inside the levy or outside the levy?
depends on if you do a referendum. If it requires a referendum, it'll be outside the levy. If you don't do a referendum, it's inside. Or, excuse me, I nearly made a mistake. The debt service is outside the maximum levy. If it's passed by referendum, it's also outside the tax caps. But if it is not passed with referendum, then it's inside the tax caps.
So that could affect us more.
Yes, it would. If the county were to do a bond issue without a referendum, it would raise the rate, and that would mean that in places like Delphi and Delphi schools, their total rate would be up and their tax cap losses would increase.
Or income tax is subject to that. You get a special rate income tax.
Oh, you could use a special rate income tax to pay for the jail, that's true.
That's the information we've been getting, is if you really want to build a jail, it'd be through income tax, not property tax.
Well, that a lot of jails have been built with what used to be the seated and is now the community economic development part of the local income tax. There's also been several special legislation rates passed for particular counties for purposes like that.
The new 2/10 on the income tax, you don't have to have a referendum for that, right?
No, when you say the new 2/10,
Yeah, they just passed that.
You don't have to split it. You don't have to share.
They have a special income tax that they just passed in session for, just specifically for jail.
oh, all right. Well, that's, I'll have to look that one up.
Yeah.
But no, if it's part of the ordinary lid, then that's just a county council decision.
But our lid, we only have a specific, we only have like 0.44 to beat the cap. And that means if we can't raise enough to fund the jail out of that lid, out of that revenue. So where do you get the rest of the revenue? I suppose it would go to property tax.
Well, and that's the property tax is really the go-to tax for most debt
That's
service.
Yeah.
The thing that the LIT did was to the new local income tax law that's now in its second year, combined all of the old Coadjutors seated rates into one big rate and essentially increased flexibility. There used to be individual rate limits on each one of those income taxes, but now the rate limit is, what is it, it's about 3%, I think. And so so that means that if you wanted to do the public safety rate at 1%, you could do that instead of 2.25. If you wanted to do a economic development rate at that amount, or a certified share general rate at that amount. 2.5? No, it's 2.5 on the expenditure, and then it's $1.25 on the property tax relief. I think when you add it, that's right. That's what it is. Good deal of flexibility, and of course, when you do that rate, that means your taxpayer is paying income taxes. Property tax relief in there is in fact a way that can reduce your tax cap losses. If you use local income taxes for property tax relief, that reduces the tax bills that people pay, which means fewer of them would be at their tax cap. Now, your losses at $500,000 here are relatively small compared to most counties. But if you want to reduce that, you could do it within. I hear a deafening silence.
Definitely
A sigh of relief.
Well, yes.
Still cool.
Okay, and this is one thing I wanted to know. Actually, I'm writing a column that is due tomorrow, and I wanted to use some of the data from here, and I thought, well, I'll put in the column that the numbers are not very big. And then I thought, well, are they not very big? I don't know whether they're very big or not. Why don't I ask some people who actually are going to face those numbers and see what they think about it.
Half a buck.
I have the answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, your business is our biggest, 4% loss by 2022, do you think it's levy increase?
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't sound like it would be an
All right.
issue, so.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.